Because just as there are wills of physical assets that we have, there's also a will of spiritual assets. What we will pass on to other generations with what we value, with what we believe, with what we desire for them to know of our God. And God encourages us through his word again and again and again, not just to think of today, not just to think of ourselves, and not just to think of our generation, but to think about the generations to come. And not just our kids' generation, but our grandkids and fourth and fifth generation down the road. He encourages us to look down the road. But sometimes what we see is what happens when the church hasn't done a good job of that, when God's people haven't done a great job of passing on their values. In fact, Judges chapter 2 is just one of those passages. And as a spiritual leader, this is one of those passages that causes me great concern. It says the Israelites served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the leaders who outlived him, those who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Now, Joshua and the other leaders had seen God do miraculous, awesome things. Joshua was the right hand to Moses. He had seen the pillars of fire and cloud leading the people. He'd seen God provide food miraculously in the desert. He'd seen the parting of the Red Sea. He'd seen all these great things. He saw the parting of the Jordan River and the entrance into the promised land and going into Canaan. He saw again and again God provide for his people miraculously. And so Joshua had experienced all that. And then we see this with Joshua, a simple statement that actually says quite a bit. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord Moses, died at the age of 110. That's a good life, a long life. And they buried him in the land he had been allocated at Timnath-Serah in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. But then this is the verse that causes me pause. After that generation died, another generation grew up who neither acknowledged the Lord nor remembered the mighty things he had done for Israel. Church, that should cause all of us pause. We're just one generation away from being obsolete. I mean, this is Joshua, one of the heroes of faith, and his generation. They entered into the promised land. They had seen God provide in such miraculous ways. And the next generation had neither seen nor heard nor revered nor followed. About 20 years ago, I was a high school social studies teacher, but I was also high school track and field coach. And when I coached track and field, I loved coaching track and field. Man, it's a fun sport. It was my sport when I was younger. And of all the events, I love coaching all the events, but one of the events that was most fun for me was coaching the relays, all the different relays, the 4x1, 4x2, the medley relay, the 4x4, 4x8. I mean, it's just fun. And you might not know, unless you've been a runner, unless you've been in a relay, that those races actually aren't won all on speed. It's not just on how fast the athletes are. In fact, you could have the 4 fastest athletes at a track meet and put them in a relay, and they might still lose. Because the relay is won not just in the speed of the athlete, but in how well they pass the baton. In fact, we seldom had the 4 fastest athletes on our team, but we usually, almost always, won our relays. In fact, we'd go to state and we'd win relay meet. We'd win the state with our relays. And our athletes, they weren't the fastest athletes, but they were the best, they were the smoothest at passing the baton, taking it from one person and getting it to the hand of another. The relay is won or lost with how you pass the baton. The race is won or lost with how you pass the baton. And here we see in Judges chapter 2 that one generation drops the baton. Now, what we see also is later on, there are those faithful who bend down, pick it up, and continue to run. But church, it's incumbent upon us to make sure we do all that we can to pass the baton well to the generations who will come behind us. We've got to be intentional about not just passing on our valuables, but also passing on our values. Proverbs 22:6 tells us that it's upon us to train up our children. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old, he won't depart from it. And you've probably seen this verse before. You've probably seen it on a cute coffee mug or a wall hanging. And we know we need to train up our children. We need to impart information to them, impart our wisdom to them, to pass on not just our wealth, but our knowledge to them. And you've seen this verse, but unfortunately, this isn't exactly the way the verse was written originally. In fact, this verse actually comes from the Hebrew text, right? So the original language that Proverbs was written in was ancient Hebrew. And in the ancient Hebrew, in the original text of the ancient Hebrew, the word should does not appear there. It actually reads this way: train up a child in the way he goes, and then even when he's old, he won't depart from it. It keeps more with the pithy wisdom of Proverbs. It's not so much a promise, but a proverbial wisdom. It reads this, right? This is a slight but very significant difference. That if you train your child in the way your child naturally goes, and when your child's older, naturally they're gonna go the way they've always gone. Now, how many parents we got in the room? Any parents in the room? Parents online? You say, yeah, I'm one, right? How many of your children are naturally bent towards righteousness? Like, how many of your kids naturally shared their toys with another? How many of them naturally spoke gratitude to people? How many of you never had to teach your kids how to write a thank you note and how to say? They just did it on their own. How many of you, your kids just were natural little conduits of grace and mercy and kindness, and like they never threw a fit in the supermarket checkout aisle? They never got bent about things, right? Like, no, right? Like for most of us, for nearly all kids, that's not how it went. And you know why? Because they got mama's DNA in them, they got daddy's DNA in them, right? Like, because they're our kids, because they're human. And as humans, we're all flawed, right? Like, most kids don't interact that way naturally. In fact, what comes natural is selfishness and greed and a lack of gratitude and impatience and on and on and on. And for our kids, it's really fortunate for them that they're cute, because if our kids looked like gremlins, they would never make it to puberty, right? Like, we would end them long before that. Like, man, it's a good thing you're cute, because your attitude is not. If your attitude looked like if you looked like your attitude, like, boom, it's just done. We're like, put you out in the doghouse, right? Now listen, some of you, you've heard this proverb and you've heard it as a promise. You've heard, well, if I raise my kid in the church, and I take him to Sunday school, and I get him involved in kids' men, I get him involved in student ministry, and we pray before meals, and we sometimes talk about Jesus in the home, and we do the good church thing, and then when they're old, they're gonna be fine. They're gonna go to church, they're gonna follow God, it's gonna be good, and they're fine. That's just not what it says. Like, you can trust your Bible, but just know that sometimes the translation gets tricky and we miss it a little bit. This is just not what this verse says. It's actually telling us that if we don't work to impart righteousness to our kids, then obviously they're not just gonna catch it from the wind. That if we don't work against the natural inclination of our children and work against their sinfulness, then when they're older, of course, they're gonna keep walking in the way of their sin. And so we have to push hard against that. We've got to train against that and train them against their natural sin tendencies and train them for righteousness. And if we train them for righteousness, then maybe they'll overcome those sin tendencies. But here's what we know: that our kids have their own free will, that they are their own people, that they're going to choose to be who they want to be, not necessarily who we would desire them to be. And we can do everything we can. It's just like when I was coaching my athletes. You got to get that baton, you got to put it in their hand. Your job is to put the baton in their hand, but it's their job to grab hold and keep running. You get the baton there, it's up to them if they take hold of it. And some of you, because you've heard this as a promise, and because things with your kid have played out different than you thought it would, you feel like God has lied to you. You feel like he's failed you. Or you feel like you failed God. Or maybe like you failed your kids. Or maybe all of it. So I just want to remind us to give ourselves some patience there, right? Like, our kids are gonna mess up. Our kids are gonna drop the baton. Our kids aren't always gonna grab hold of the baton of faith right away. And some of them are gonna mess up in ways very similar to us, and sometimes they'll mess up in ways very different than us, and sometimes it won't be as bad as we did, sometimes it'll be worse than we did, and we gotta learn how to help them navigate all that. But what we know is that sometimes our kids are going to mess up. And you know why? Because they're human. Because they have our DNA in them. Listen, pastor's family, not excluded. Just because I'm a preacher doesn't mean my kids don't make mistakes. Just because I'm a preacher doesn't mean I don't make mistakes. I make plenty of them. So do my kids. And it happens. You know, sometimes we as parents, we blow it, right? Not like we say what we shouldn't say, or we don't say what we should, or we say what we should, but we say it in the wrong way, or sometimes we're too passive, or we're too angry, or we're too this, or we're too that, or we're doing our best to navigate, and we try to help them. And listen, as parents, we are going to drop the ball. We're going to mess it up. We're going to mess it. I just tell my kids, listen, I'm just giving you something to talk to your counselor about later on, right? Like, you're welcome. Enjoy this in 10 years when you're paying money to talk to the counselor. I'm just setting it up for you. But if we do the best we can according to God's word, now we could really mess up if we say, forget God, and we're trying to do it all on our own. But as we submit to God, we surrender to him, and we do our best to follow, we're still gonna mess it up. But here's what you need to know, because our kids are gonna mess up too. And so I wanna encourage you parents to give yourselves some grace, because you are not responsible for every decision that your child makes. They have free will. Especially the older they get, the more it's on them. And so give yourself some grace there. Now with that, do what you can to lead them well and to pass the baton as smoothly as you can. You know, in the Fitz home, we've realized, and I'll tell you, my wife is way better at this than I am. But we've realized through the years that perhaps the most important part of our legacy will be how we interact with our children when they aren't doing well. When it comes to those times when they mess up, we need to show them God. We need to respond to them the way God responds to us when we're not doing well. With grace and mercy and love and tenderness and compassion and forgiveness, while still holding us accountable and showing us truth and being firm. And so a phrase that my wife and I have learned, that no matter what is going on in the home, a phrase that we've learned that suits us well, is when our kids mess up, we just let them know, we love you, we're for you, we're here for you, and we are going to get through this together. Love you, we're for you, we're here for you, and together we'll get through it together. Now, we don't always know what that looks like. We don't always know what all that means. We don't always know how all the tension is going to get worked out, and we don't do it perfectly. But we do know that that's how God has responded to us again and again.